We set out for the great hunt which has become Operation Darknet, also known as to catch a predator.
People assume a pedo is someone with two heads running around, but really they're just your neighbour, your brother.
We've all heard terrible stories about the dark web, and there are many rumors about the disturbing content you can find there. Unfortunately, a lot of that is true. It's shocking that anybody would want to access the most upsetting videos, and even more unbearable to think of the vulnerable, defenseless people it hurts along the way. In this upsetting case, we take a look at someone who had started off trying to help catch the monsters, only to get more involved in distributing the monstrous videos. He claimed these were created in the name of free speech. But there are some people who successfully hunt these kinds of monsters, and it isn't easy, because all too often they blend right into the normal world. Near the end of August 2014, police from Victoria, Australia, raided the very ordinary suburban home of a 50-something mechanic in Melbourne. He lived there with his wife and 2 children. But there was nothing ordinary about what they were searching for. Information from multiple agencies, from the FBI and an operation called Task Force Argos, had concluded that someone in that family home was hosting the very worst kind of dark web video material. At first, the officers had assumed it was the father, but something didn't add up. Detective Senior Constable Stafford had noticed something odd about another member of the household, and what she concluded was incredibly disturbing. Someone in that house was more than willing to publish the most troubling and upsetting material any of the investigators had ever seen on the darkest parts of the internet. And it wasn't who they first thought. The sick monster was known only as Lux, and how he got his start just makes what he did even more incredible and awful. But how did he even begin to find out about this gruesome underworld? In 2011, Anonymous ran a hacking campaign against the sick dark web-based site called Freedom Hosting. This awful place allowed people to view extremely disgusting and exploitative material. They called it Operation Darknet. Anonymous claimed that their efforts to expose the IP and email addresses of a worryingly high number of users have been very successful.
We set out for the great hunt which has become Operation Darknet, also known as to catch a predator.
But they should also have been wary of this quote. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Nietzsche. This famous statement tends to mean that if you spend too long in darkness, then it will corrupt you as well. Hopefully, their campaign did a lot of good, at least in the short term, but there was a far darker result. The effect of raising this awareness also spread the word about where and how to access all that stomach-churning material. In short, it drove a lot of the wrong people to take a look at it. And that included a curious user called Lux, who read about it on the notorious 4chan message boards. He joined the anonymous hacking for Operation Darknet. However, when he was meant to be bringing down the material, he instead became fascinated by it. At first, I felt ashamed of myself for being attracted to such a thing, but as time went on, I slowly grew more accepting of myself. It wasn't until I came across the Tor community that I was able to truly feel comfortable with attractions. After Operation Darknet had ended, Lux decided he'd rather help these sick people to access even more of the CP they wanted. He was inspired to become the emperor of this material, proudly creating what he called his CP empire. To seem more convincing, when he started collecting the material, he claimed that he was a twisted doctor to minors. He would gleefully describe how he exploited his innocent young patients, then created and opened 3 extremely popular forums on a server called the Dark Web. Let's just say, none of those site names would be considered safe for work or safe for life. Each one was more revolting than the last, and in order to gain access to the most depraved material, the sick users often had to create material of their own, regularly. So these disgusting forums were guaranteed to generate more trauma every day they were up. All 3 of Lux's dark websites were terrible places, but the worst one was H2TC. This one prompted physically harming and injuring the young victims and specialized in a genre known as hardcore. Even regular users of the other sickening CP material were utterly repelled by it. Even they hated Lux for what he was promoting. One of the most notorious videos on the site was about the destruction of 3 young victims. It's so upsetting that I can't even name it here, and its creation even resulted in one of the victims passing away. Eager to get that awful video as a publicity stunt, Lux had spoken directly to the maker of the appalling film and tried to make a deal to get the rights. He'd even offered them $900,000 in Bitcoin. When that failed, Lux got hold of sections of it anyway, and gleefully posted it for his audience, although no sane person would ever want to watch it. But it did get his sick little business much more attention than he probably wanted. The agencies who hunted the makers and distributors of CP closed all across the world. The clock began ticking. The first place where Lux stored his filth, Freedom Hosting, was fully shut down by the FBI in 2012, so Lux began hosting the CP personally in search of his complete freedom for everyone except the helpless victims of his site. Lux also taunted the FBI investigators. Well, it looks like this empire hasn't fallen just yet to any law enforcement agencies reading this. But this is never a smart strategy, and Lux could probably feel them closing in right behind him. By 2014, Lux was convinced he was in serious danger of being caught. The net was closing in as one by one, his other CP hosting associates got picked up by the cops, although none of them knew exactly who he was either. So, Lux was starting to plan his escape from attention, and in early June, he even emailed the FBI offering to hand over everything he had in his empire for $50,000 in Bitcoin and immunity from any agency across the world. This didn't work, so Lux completely closed down his awful empire on June 24, 2014. The way he words his resignation, you'd almost think he was some sort of war hero, instead of a sick freak hosting content for sadistic cowards.
There are personal issues which my close friends have been made aware of that have forced me to make this decision. I don't like awkward farewells, so goodbye. Regards,
Lux pretended it was because he had a brain tumor, but it was likely more because the cops caught another one of his most prolific collaborators. Despite his attempts to get away, the police were snapping even closer to his heels. The Queensland Police had created Task Force Argos back in 2002, and they worked closely with other agencies to identify victims and drew the net tighter and tighter around Lux. This all leads us back to that unassuming family home in Melbourne in August 2014. When Detective Christy Stafford realized the family's 21-year-old son, Matthew David Graham, had no online presence at all, that seemed incredibly odd for someone his age. Even his Facebook profile was hard to see.
He was considered the worst administrator of some of the worst websites in the world at the time. So we knew who the user was, we just had to make the connection to that Lux was Matthew Graham.
Matthew was a 21-year-old nanotechnology student who, at first glance, seemed like an overachiever, if a bit of an introvert. He never went to college in person and preferred staying at home and being on his laptop. His family had no clue what Matthew was really doing in his room, but the police had a good idea of exactly who he was. They just had to get all the proof, so they demanded access to his laptop. Matthew refused to allow the police any access to those or his USB drives, but he did hand over his smartphone. This turned out to be a dumb thing to do. The sneaky device had cached something very incriminating. The police found the cache file held 3 awful images of very young minors, and this was enough to arrest him for possession of the material.
When I first saw him on the day that we served the warrant, I was surprised by his confidence, that he was quite calm in that environment. In his mind, I can't imagine how that would have been going, him thinking, have they got me? Because obviously there's a bit of bluff. What we've got, what we don't have, not all our cards are played at the time.
So, the police had an even greater reason to seize this sicko's hard drives, but he'd locked them so well, even the FBI and Europol, a German agency, couldn't get into them. But before long, the agency had drawn just enough information to confirm he was the elusive Lux. Matthew was given a tough choice. Because his crimes crossed the borders, in the US they could charge him for a huge number of offenses.
The level of and the type of content that he was dealing with was considered the worst in the world by FBI, by Europol.
Or he could own up to his connection and remain in Australia. The threat of extradition and much more severe charges seemed to do the trick, and Matthew agreed to share his hard drive password. He had to type it onto a keyboard instead of writing it down, as the muscle memory kicked in. The shocking material they found connected him to 13 specific charges.
He was surprising. When it got to the interview, how candid and open he was to talk about that level of depravity. That it didn't flinch, it just rolled off his tongue what he was talking about.
For instance, he'd advised a Russian how to abduct and ruin a preschooler, and lots of other disgusting videos, including the destruction video. He also babysat the local neighbors' kids, so I really hope nothing happened to them while he was watching.
People assume someone with two heads running around, but really they're just your neighbour, your brother.
In September 2015, he was sent to trial. Remember, Matthew claimed he never did anything wrong and was even protecting free speech. He was charged with 88 offenses, and he created unbearable misery, suffering, and even death wherever he went. And he didn't even seem to care that the victims were being hurt. Their right to be safe just didn't matter to him at all. After viewing a part of the disturbing material for context during the end of the trial, the horrified Judge Tinney put it best. I have seen some shocking things over the journey of my career, and I have never seen anything like that. It is as if he is from another planet. It's still horrifying that Matthew got into this all because Anonymous had tried to do something good, so perhaps the road to hell really is paved with good intentions. But at least the determined international effort to end his evil was able to free many of the victims involved. What continues to be horrifying is the constant high demand for this sickening material, which is still being made all across the world and consumed by the most repulsive people on the internet. It still takes a lot of difficult, old-school detective work to follow the clues and rescue the victims. Over 30 victims were saved directly thanks to the investigation into Matthew Graham's repellent hard drives. But what became of Matthew David Graham, who was also diagnosed with more than one major personality disorder? On March 17, 2015, Matthew Graham was eventually sentenced to just 15 years for his part in running these sites. That's shockingly low. And even worse, he'll be eligible for parole in a minimum of 10 years. So by around 2025, he could be set free again. It's telling that in 2018, there were reports of him using the prison computers to view petite blonde women and potentially manipulating the images. The abyss really has swallowed him whole. And it's called a dark web for a reason. There are still plenty of connections to Lux that need hunting down. So do be careful where you wander online, because you really never know who could be lurking behind the scene, and if they're looking back at you too. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please leave a like and subscribe. And I'd love to know what you make of this case in the comments below.